I am going to tell you something I have not said aloud in 43 years, and I am going to say it plainly because I am 78 years old, and my lungs are not what they were, and plain is all I have time for now. My name is Fernand Ouellet. I was a licensed trapper in the northern reaches of the Athabasca watershed, just east of the Birch Mountains in the province of Alberta. I worked that country from the age of 19 until I was 51, which is when my knee went and the provincial surveyor's office hired me to do what I could from a desk. Before that, I was in the bush every season, running lines from October until March, and in all those years I saw things that the wilderness gives a man who is quiet enough and patient enough to receive them. Moose calves still wet from the birth, wolves moving at the tree line in weather that should have killed them. Pike so old their scales had gone to silver all the way up to the jaw. But what happened in the winter of 1979 is different from all of that. And I want to say so before I go any further. It is not a fishing story. It is not the kind of thing a man embroiders over the years until it fits the shape of the telling. I have not told it before, not to my son Bernard, not to my wife Simone, not to the priest in Wandering River who heard my confession every Easter for 30 years, and who would not, I think, have known what to do with it. I am telling it now because Simone died in February, and the promise I made her was that I would not go to my grave with it still locked inside me, that I would find some way to put it into words before I was past the putting. So here it is. I am speaking into a small recorder on my kitchen table. The dog is asleep by the stove. Outside the window, the birch trees are bare, and the sky is the particular shade of grey that means more snow before nightfall. In October of 1979, I set out alone for my trapline cabin on Jackfish Creek, which sat 42 kilometres north of the gravel road that connected Lac La Biche to the smaller settlements above it. I went alone that season because my trapping partner, a man named Donat Savard, who had worked beside me for 11 years, had broken his collarbone the previous August falling from a grain truck he had no business being near. Donat was 54 and not healing well, and his wife Marguerite had made it plain enough that he would not be going north that winter. I did not blame her. The cabin was my own, the lines were my own, and I had run them alone before. I was 46 years old, lean and well, and I knew that country the way a man knows a house he built himself. Every soft spot in the floor, every place the cold gets in. I reached the cabin on the 3rd of October by quad on the forestry trail and on foot for the last 8 kilometres when the ground softened to muskeg. I carried 80 pounds on my back and made it in good time. The cabin was sound. The cache had not been touched. The creek was still running open, just barely, and the sky to the north had the hard pewter look that means freeze is coming within the week. I spent the first 10 days in ordinary preparation, cutting and stacking firewood from the deadfall I had flagged the previous spring, checking the stovepipe, checking the roof where a squirrel had worked a corner of the tar paper loose, hanging the traps to air out because a trap that smells of the shed is a trap that catches nothing. I was methodical in those years. Method is what keeps a man alive in country like that, not strength and not luck. Method and patience, and the willingness to go slow when everything in you wants to move faster than the situation allows. On the 15th of October, I started running the East Line. It went 12 kilometres out to a beaver pond, and then looped back south past a stretch of muskeg willow where the marten tended to concentrate. I had 23 sets along that line, and I walked it every third day. By the end of October, the freeze was in, and the spruce stood heavy with the first good snowfall, and the country had the deep, settled quiet that does not come in any other season. I found him on the 1st of November. I say him because that is what I came to understand over time, but on that morning I did not know what I had found. I was on the east line, halfway to the beaver pond, when my dog, Remy, stopped. Remy was a Labrador cross, 9 years old with the black gone grey around his muzzle, and he had a great deal of experience and very little inclination toward drama. When Remy stopped and held, it was because something was there. Not a sound, not a scent he had encountered before, but something that told the old dog to plant his feet and wait. I came up beside him, and I saw it. He was lying on his side in the snow, 40 feet off the line, half in and half out of a deadfall spruce that had come down sometime in the previous season, and lay with its root plate standing upright like a broken wall. He was enormous. I had seen moose lying dead and bears in the early sleep of October, and neither of those comparisons captures what I am trying to say. He was enormous the way a standing dead tree is enormous, the kind of size that makes you recalibrate the rest of what you are looking at, the brush around him, the clearing, the scale of the creek beyond. I stood there for a long moment with my rifle at my side and Remy pressed against my knee. And neither of us moved. He was breathing. I could see that from 40 feet in the cold air, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the breath coming out in a visible cloud from a face that was broad and dark, and framed in fur the colour of old river mud, dark brown and deep, with a quality of texture that was not like any fur I had seen. His eyes were closed. His right leg, the upper leg, was bent at an angle that told me, with the same clarity that a man reads a trap, that it was broken. Something large had broken it, something like a falling tree or a slope that gave way, and it had been that way long enough that there was no fresh blood in the snow around him, only the old, darkened crust of it, that said this had happened at least a day before. I did not think. A trapper does not think in those moments. He reads the situation and he acts from whatever he knows, and what I knew was that the leg was broken, the animal was alive, and the cold that had settled in overnight was around -22 degrees Celsius. I went back to the cabin, and I got what I had. I want to be precise about what that was because it matters to me that you understand I was not a doctor, and I was not a veterinarian, and I had no preparation for what I was doing. What I had was 2.5 rolls of 4-inch elastic bandaging, a partial bottle of iodine, a half-used tube of the wound salve I kept for the dog, a good supply of spruce planks I had cut for repairs, a coil of soft rope, and 43 years of watching things get hurt and watching them heal. I had also set enough broken legs on animals caught badly in the steel to know what a clean break looked like versus a shattered one, and what I had seen in the clearing was a clean break, mid-shaft, the kind that can knit if it is held still long enough and if the cold does not take the animal first. I also had a .303 rifle, and I want to say plainly that I thought about it. Any honest man would. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a quarter of an hour and I thought about what I was looking at, and whether the right thing, the merciful thing, was to end it. He was that still. He was that far down. But he was breathing, and there was something in the way he lay there, something in the quality of his stillness, that was not the stillness of an animal that has given up. It was the stillness of an animal that is waiting. That is the only word I have for it. He was waiting in a way that a rock waits, with a kind of patience that has nothing to do with hope and nothing to do with despair. I put the rifle against the deadfall and went to work. What I remember most about that first session is how long it took and how much of it was simply proximity, getting close enough and staying close enough that the knowledge of my presence had time to settle into something that was not threat. I moved in 4-foot increments. I would move forward and then crouch and wait, and when his breathing did not change, I would move forward again. It took the better part of 40 minutes before I was close enough to touch the leg, and when I did touch it, One hand laid flat and still on the fur of the lower limb. I felt the muscle beneath go rigid, and I stopped and I waited. And slowly, over perhaps 5 minutes of neither of us moving, the rigidity went out of it. I have done this with injured wolves and with elk that were caught by the wire, and the principle is the same in all cases, which is that fear is not the enemy. Fear is information, and what an animal needs when it is frightened is not reassurance, but time. Time and stillness, and the repeated proof that nothing bad is about to happen. He did not respond when I first touched him. I worked slowly, the way you work with any animal in distress, and I cleaned the wound on the leg where the break had torn through, and I laid the spruce planks along either side of the leg and wrapped it as tightly as I dared with the elastic bandaging, and I tied it with the soft rope so nothing would slip. It took the better part of 2 hours. My hands went numb twice, and I had to warm them inside my coat before I could continue. When I was done, I stood back and looked at what I had managed, and I thought it was not good enough, but that it might be enough. I brought spruce boughs and laid them around him on the windward side to cut the draught, and I went back to the cabin and boiled water, and brought it out in my largest pot with a piece of salt pork that I cut into strips and left within reach of his hand. That first night, he did not touch it. The second morning, he was still alive. I have thought about the days that followed for 43 years, and I'm not sure I can give you a precise account of when things changed, because they changed slowly, the way a river changes, in ways that are not visible in any single day, but are undeniable across the whole of a season. By the end of the first week, he had begun to eat, taking the food I left without apparent concern about where it had come from, and by the middle of the second week, he had managed to shift himself so that his back was fully against the deadfall, and he could see the clearing from that position. And when I came to change the dressing on the leg, he watched me work with those deep-set eyes, dark brown and very still, and there was something in the watching that I recognized, even though I had never seen anything like it before. He was paying attention. Not the way an animal pays attention to a threat or to food, but the way a person pays attention when they are trying to understand what another person is doing and why. The dressing changes were every 3 days. I came out in the morning before I walked the lines, and I unwound the wool strips and looked at the wound and cleaned it and rewrapped it, and I got fast enough at it by the end of November that the whole operation took under an hour. I kept a count in the back of my trapping log of how the wound was progressing, the same way I kept count of the sets and the takes, because that was the habit of my profession, and it helped me see what was changing when I was too close to it to see clearly. By the 22nd of November, the outer edges of the wound were fully closed. By the 1st of December, the swelling in the limb above and below the break had reduced by what I estimated to be half. By the 10th, there was no visible discharge, and the fur immediately adjacent to the wound had begun to come back in, which is a reliable indicator that the body has turned its resources from fighting damage to repairing it. I was feeding him salt pork and dried rabbit and cornmeal mixed with hot water. And I want to say something about the quantity required, because I think it is relevant to understanding what I was dealing with. A large man working a physical job in cold weather will consume perhaps 4,000 calories in a day. What I was bringing out to the clearing was, by my reckoning, the equivalent of perhaps 1,500 calories, and I was bringing it twice daily, and the food was gone every time I returned. This told me 2 things. The first was that the food was being eaten and not simply scattered or spoiled, which meant he was alert enough and capable enough to eat deliberately and regularly. The second was that I was nowhere near meeting his requirements, and he was drawing on his own reserves for the remainder, which meant the reserves were substantial but that they would not last indefinitely. In the second week of December, I began supplementing with the gut piles from my catch. A trapper guts his animals in the field, and the pile he leaves goes to ravens and foxes in the ordinary course of things, and I had always left mine along the lines without a second thought. That winter, I packed them back. It was more weight to carry, and it changed the timing of my work, but the alternative was to watch the reserves run out, and that I was not prepared to do. I talked to him while I worked. This is not something I was aware of deciding to do. It simply happened, the way talking to yourself happens when you are alone in the bush for weeks at a time, and he seemed to settle when I talked, seemed to hold himself steadier, so I kept on doing it. I told him what I was doing with the bandage. I told him the weather was going to hold cold for another 2 weeks at least. I told him the beaver pond was frozen solid now, and I had checked it that morning on the way out. I told him about Donut Savard and the grain truck and the broken collarbone and how Marguerite had put her foot down, and I believe it was the first time in 43 years I found the story genuinely funny. He did not laugh. I want to be clear about that. He was not a man. He did not share my language or my frame of reference or my sense of what was absurd. But when I talked, his breathing slowed, and when I was quiet for too long, it quickened again, and I learned to read that the way I learned to read everything else about him, slowly and carefully, and without deciding in advance what it meant. By the end of November, he could put weight on the leg, not walk on it, not yet, but bear some portion of his weight when he shifted, and the colour of the wound had gone from the dark red that worried me to the healthy pink that meant it was closing. I had used all the elastic bandaging by then and had begun cutting strips from a wool blanket to wrap the leg, and he tolerated this with the same patience he brought to everything, sitting still while I worked, watching my hands. Remy had made his peace with the situation by the second week of November. I will not pretend it happened all at once. The first few visits to the clearing, Remy stayed close to my knee and his hackles stayed up. But he watched and he learned, the way old dogs learn. And by the time the first heavy snow of December came in over 3 days and filled the clearing to the level of my thighs, Remy was content to sit 5 feet from the deadfall and wait for me to finish my work. And occasionally he placed his grey muzzle on the ground between his paws and watched the large figure against the spruce roots with what I can only describe as professional courtesy. I want to say something about the winter itself. People who have not spent a season in the northern bush often imagine it as a period of privation, of cold endured and darkness endured and the long wait for the spring. And there is that. There is certainly that. But there is also something else, a quality that the country takes on when the freeze is fully in and the snow is deep and the light lasts only a few hours at either end of the day, a quality of compression, of everything essential being drawn down to its smallest and truest form. The fire in the stove, the smell of spruce in the frost, the tracks in the snow that tell you what moved in the night and what direction it was going. 43 years of winters had given me those things, and I had never taken them for granted, and that winter they were sharper than any I had known before. Part of that sharpness was him. I am not going to overstate this because the voice I have for this account is not the voice of a man who overstates things, and I want you to receive this as the plain observation it is. His presence in that clearing changed the quality of my attention to the country around me. I moved more carefully. I listened more carefully. In 32 years of trapping, I had become competent at reading the bush, which is to say I had learned what to look for and learned to find it. That winter, I found myself looking for things I had not known to look for before. The way the spruce tips bent under the weight of ice and then released. The places where the snow was disturbed at a depth and breadth that no hare or fox or marten could account for, old disturbances, months old, that spoke of regular movement through the country by something large and careful. He had been here before, that much was clear. He knew this country in a way that went beyond familiarity into something older and more settled than any single season, and even lying against the deadfall with the broken leg outstretched, he wore that knowledge the way he wore the cold, which was without apparent effort. In December, I began sitting with him in the evenings. Not every evening, but the ones when the weather held, and I had finished my work at the cabin by mid-afternoon, and there was still light enough to walk the line to the clearing. I brought food, and I sat on a section of the fallen spruce, and he leaned against the root plate, and we kept each other company in the way that does not require language and does not require anything to be explained. I want to describe what those evenings were like, because they were not what you might imagine if you have not spent time in the northern bush in December. There was not much light. By 3 in the afternoon, the sky was the dark blue of a bruise, and by 4, it was fully dark, and I sat in that darkness with a man-sized figure leaning against the spruce roots, and the sound of his breathing, and the sound of Remy shifting in the snow beside me, and the occasional crack of frost in the trees. I brought a small lantern on some visits and left it on the spruce log between us, not for warmth, but for the light, because there is a quality to that particular darkness that is not frightening, but is very large, and the lantern made it smaller in a way that felt right for sitting in company. He did not react to the lantern beyond the first visit, when his eyes tracked to it briefly, when I set it down, and then moved away again, with the incurious thoroughness that I had begun to associate with him, the way he looked at a thing fully, and then was finished with it. One evening in the middle of December, I brought my trapping log and my pencil, and made notes by the lantern light, while he sat, and the night came in around us. I wrote down the dressing measurements and the food quantities, and some observations about the healing progress, and I was aware as I wrote that he was watching the pencil move, not in the manner of something that is confused or disturbed by what it sees, but in the manner of something that has noted a new behavior and is filing it away. I do not know what a man moving a small stick across a small book looks like to something of his kind. I do not know what any of it looked like from his side of the lantern. That is one of the things I have been content to leave unresolved, because I think the honesty of not knowing is worth more than the comfort of a wrong answer. He made sounds sometimes, not often, and never when I was working on the leg, only when I was sitting quietly at a distance from him, as though it were a form of conversation that he only felt easy about, when neither of us was in the middle of something else. It was a low sound, below what I would call a vocalization, more in the chest than in the throat, and it had a quality of continuity to it, as though it were not responding to me specifically, but to the general fact of the evening, the cold and the dark, and the two of us in that clearing together. I have thought about that sound for a long time, and the best I can say is that it was a sound a man might make sitting by a fire when things are not good, but they are not getting worse, when the night is long but there is enough wood stacked to see it through. By January, the leg had healed enough that he could stand. I was there when he did it for the first time, on the 6th of January, and I want to say it plainly because it is one of the things I see most clearly when I close my eyes. He put the damaged leg down slowly, with a caution that was not timidity but precision, and he straightened to his full height, and I stepped back without thinking, not from fear or not entirely from fear, but from something closer to what you feel when you are standing in a room where a very large thing has shifted and the proportions have changed. He was 9 feet tall. I am a tall man, and he was nearly a full yard above me, and his shoulders across were the width of the doorframe of this cabin, and his arms, when he held them slightly out from his body for balance, were the arms of something that had been made for a country much larger and older than the one I knew. He stood for a few minutes and then he sat back down. He did it again 2 days later for longer. By the third week of January, he was walking the perimeter of the clearing slowly with the careful deliberateness of a man learning to trust a mended bone. And I stood at the edge of the tree line and watched him and did not go into the clearing while he moved, because that felt right. The way staying out of a room while someone is dressing feels right. A matter of basic decency. I watched him walk for the first time on the 18th of January, and I want to say something about what it looked like, because this is the part of the account that I am most certain I am not doing justice to. He moved the way the country moved, which is to say without the quality of effort that marks human movement. A man moving through snow of that depth moves against it, fighting the resistance of each step, pulling his leg free and driving it forward again. He did not move that way. He moved through the snow the way a current moves through water, with the weight of the snow registering in his body as information rather than obstacle. And the sound of his steps in the packed clearing was softer than you would expect from something of his size, a sound more like cloth on cloth than like boots on crust. And Remy watched him from beside my knee with his ears forward and his tail moving slowly in the way that means interest rather than alarm. When he had gone most of the way around the clearing, he stopped and turned and looked at me across the 30 feet of open ground between us. And I looked back, and I do not have words for what passed in that looking, except to say that it was mutual, and it was clear, and that both of us understood, I think, that something had changed. He was going to be well. The leg had done what it needed to do, and the cold had not taken him, and the long stillness of November and December was behind him, and what was ahead of him was the country to the north. Remy sat beside me and watched too, and neither of us said anything about it. February came in hard. -38 for 4 days, the kind of cold that makes the spruce crack at night, like rifle shots, and turns your breath to ice on your scarf before it has properly left your body. I stayed close to the cabin during those days and brought extra food out to the clearing and left it at the edge and did not stay, because staying in that cold for any length of time was not practical, and I did not think he needed me there, had perhaps not needed me there for some time, and had simply allowed the arrangement to continue in the patient way he allowed most things. On the 10th of February, when the cold broke and the temperature came back up to something a man could work in, I went out to the clearing, and he was on his feet. He had been walking in the clearing, I could see the tracks in the snow, and when I came through the spruce he turned and looked at me, and I stopped, and he looked at me for what I would estimate was 3 or 4 minutes, which is a long time to hold still in the cold, but not a long time in the way this particular kind of time moves. Then he turned and looked at the trees on the north side of the clearing, the dark wall of spruce that pressed in from the direction of the Birch Mountains. And then he turned back and looked at me once more. I understood him. I want to be clear that I am not claiming he communicated in any language I can give a name to. But I understood him, the way you understand a man who points at a door and then looks at you and waits. The door is there. The question is whether you are going to object to him using it. I did not object. I took a step back toward the south tree line and I stood there, and he watched me do it, and then he turned and walked north. And in 10 steps he was in the trees, and in 20 steps there was nothing to see but the snow and the spruce and the path he had made in the drifts, which was already, in the light wind that was blowing down from the mountains, beginning to fill in. Remy pressed his nose to the tracks and lifted his grey head and watched the tree line for a long moment, and then he sat down in the snow beside me, and we both stood there until the light began to go and the cold started to come back in from the east. I went back to the cabin, and I sat at the table for a long time without lighting the lamp. I do not know exactly what I was doing in that time. Not grieving, or not primarily, not celebrating. Something quieter than either of those things. Something in the register of a man who has finished a piece of work that mattered and is sitting with the finished feeling before he moves on to whatever comes next. I finished the season. I ran the East Line and the West Line and the Creek Line through February and into March, and I took the Martin and the Beaver I had come north for, and I broke camp in good order in the last week of March. On the day I walked out, I went to the clearing one more time, not because I expected anything, but because it seemed like the thing to do. The deadfall spruce was there, and the root plate, and the impression his body had left in the compressed snow against the root plate, which the cold had preserved in the way the cold preserves everything that lies still long enough. I stood in that clearing for a little while, and I said the only words I had for it, which were not elegant and were not the words of a man who has spent much time composing prayers, and then I walked south toward the road, and I did not look back. I told Simone about it that summer. I had not intended to. We had been married 11 years by then, and she was a practical woman, a licensed practical nurse who had spent 12 years on a surgical ward in Athabasca before we moved out to the acreage. And I was reasonably confident she would receive a story like this one in the spirit of something that needed examining carefully before any conclusions were drawn. But I told her anyway, on an evening in July when we were sitting on the back step watching the light go and the bats come out from under the eaves, and I told her all of it in the same order I have told it to you. And when I was done, she sat with it for a long time. Then she said, "I believe you." She said it in the same tone she used when she told a patient that the procedure had gone well, which was a tone that carried no drama and a great deal of weight. And I understood that she was not telling me she thought I had imagined nothing, or that she was prepared to entertain a generous interpretation of an unusual experience. She was telling me she believed it happened the way I said it happened. She made me promise to keep it between us. Not because she was ashamed of it, she said, but because some things are not helped by being offered to people who are not ready for them. I thought that was right. It still seems right to me, sitting at this table 43 years later, with the grey sky outside and the dog sleeping by the stove. I went back to that country every season for 5 more years before the knee finally quit. I ran the same lines, the same clearing, the East Pond and the West Run and the creek sets, and I went to the clearing on the 1st of November each of those 5 years, partly to check the deadfall, which was slowly becoming part of the ground, and partly for the same reason I just described, because it seemed like the right thing to do. In October of 1981, the second fall after that winter, I found something at the clearing. It was set at the base of the root plate, set there with the same deliberateness with which you set a thing down in a place where you intend it to be found. It was a large piece of birch bark, stripped cleanly in the way bark is stripped when it is taken by hands rather than by weathering, and folded over once. And inside the fold was a marten kit, dead and recently so, with its pelt intact, folded as neatly as a piece of cloth. I do not know what it means. I have thought about it for 43 years, and I still do not know what it means. And I am willing to say that plainly, because that is the kind of not knowing that I think deserves to be kept intact. It is possible it was a coincidence, the kit dying there and the bark blowing in from somewhere and the two things arriving at the same place, by accident. It is possible it means what it looks like it means, which is that someone placed it there for me to find, that it was a gesture of a kind for which I have no category, a form of acknowledgement or gratitude or reciprocation that existed in a language I could not read but could receive. I still have the birch bark. It is in the chest under the back bedroom window, under an old Hudson's Bay blanket. The Martin kit is long gone, of course, but the bark is still there, and it still has the quality of something that was handled carefully, deliberately, by something that understood what careful and deliberate meant. Simone used to take it out sometimes, not often, but when something had been hard and she wanted to hold something that she trusted, without needing to explain why she trusted it. She held it when Bernard was born, and she held it the winter her sister died, and she held it in February of this year, 3 days before she left me, and I put it back in the chest myself the next morning, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought about a man and an animal in a clearing in the cold, and about the particular quality of patience that passes between two things that have agreed to wait out the night together. The country up around Jackfish Creek is not what it was. The Birch Mountains Road has gone through now, and there are gas leases north of where I used to trap, and the forestry trail that I used to reach the cabin has been widened and gravelled for industrial traffic. I have not been there since the knee quit. I do not know if the clearing is still a clearing, or whether the spruce has come back in to fill it, the way spruce always comes back in, the way the country always reclaims what it held before. I do not need to go back. That is not a diminishment. That is something I understand now, that I did not understand when I was younger, that the places where the important things happened are still the places where they happened, regardless of what the surface looks like. The clearing is a clearing in the only way that matters, which is in the account I am setting down here, and in the birch bark in the chest under the back bedroom window, and in the memory of a grey-muzzled old dog sitting in the snow with his nose to a set of tracks that were already filling in. I will say this last thing, and then I will stop. I am not a man who talks easily about what a thing means. I am a man who has spent most of his life reading what the country shows him and taking it on those terms, without requiring it to resolve into something he can explain to a stranger. But I have had 43 years to sit with this particular piece of country, and what I have come to understand is something I would not have said out loud to anyone but Simone, which is that the world is not the size we are told it is when we are young. It is larger than that. It is older than that. And in that larger, older world, there are forms of fidelity and forms of care that do not require a shared language and do not require an explanation, and do not, when they are finished, require a ceremony of any kind. You do what needs doing. You do it as well as you can with what you have. And then, if you are patient, and if you are quiet, and if you have done the work well enough, the thing you kept alive walks back into the country that made it, and you stand in the snow, and you watch it go. And that is enough. That is enough.